Hello friends, I am Sunil Ranjan and I am an English teacher. Now, here in this session, I have come up with Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. So, here I am giving you the summary of the novel. Charlotte Bronte was an English novelist and poet. She was the eldest of the three Bronte sisters. Her novels became classics of English literature. She wrote Jane Eyre under the pen name Currer Bell. She became famous for her novel Jane Eyre that was published in 1847. The novel is a strong narrative of a woman in conflict with her natural desires and social condition. The novel gave new truthfulness to Victorian fiction. Jane Eyre is the daughter of a clergyman. She becomes an orphan at a young age. Her maternal uncle adopts her but later dies. Jane is left at the mercy of a cruel aunt who becomes very harsh to her. Jane's cousins and the maids of the house torture her and beat her. She always thinks that she is dependent on them. Jane is sent by her aunt, Mrs. Reeds, to a charitable school called Lowood School, where she meets the same fate. The director of the school, Mr. Brocklehurst, is cruel as well as a miser. A teacher, Miss Temple, shows sympathy towards Jane. Jane makes friendship with Helen Burns, whose religious devotion, simplicity, and goodness attract her. Once, when Jane is accused of being a liar and a deceitful person by the director, she becomes depressed, but later she is cleared of all the charges by Miss Temple. At Lowood School, an infectious disease, typhus, breaks out. It results in the death of a number of schoolgirls. Helen Burns also dies, but not of typhus, but she dies of consumption. Jane remains there as a student for 8 years. She teaches in the same school for 2 years, but later she decides to change the job. Bessie, who is the maid of Reed's family, visits Jane and tells her that the cousin of Jane, John Reeds, has become a big disappointment for Mr. Reeds. Jane's cousin Georgiana attempts to elope with her lover. However, her plan is discovered by her sister Eliza, who prevents her elopement. Jane Eyre gets the job of governess to a young French girl, Adele, at Thornfield Hall. Jane feels quite comfortable and often goes to the terrace and looks at the sky. She feels troubled by the unusual laughing in the top floor of Thornfield Hall. Once, when she is out for a walk, a man falls off a horse. Jane helps him getting up. When she comes back, she finds the same person at Thornfield Hall. She is introduced to 38-year-old Mr. Rochester, who is the owner of Thornfield Hall. As time passes, Jane and Rochester become good friends. Jane and Rochester tell each other about their past life. One night, Rochester's bed is set on fire by some unknown person. Jane saves him. She suspects that Grace Poole, a maid at Thornfield Hall, might have done that. Jane secretly begins to love Rochester. She is told by Mrs. Fairfax, who is in charge of the mansion, that Rochester might marry a beautiful and rich girl, Miss Blanche Ingram. The information tortures Jane and she decides to leave the job to avoid the pain and sorrow of losing her love. Rochester, who had gone out without telling anybody, returns after some days with a group of his friends who stay there for a fortnight. One day, a man named Mason visits Thornfield Hall. In the night, he is attacked by a lady who is unknown to Jane. He gets severely wounded and a surgeon is called for his treatment. Jane tries to know about the strange lady living on the third floor of the same house, but Rochester puts her off. Jane visits Mrs. Reeds, who is on her deathbed. She tells Jane that her uncle John Eyre desired to meet Jane, but Mrs. Reeds did not like his meeting her. Mrs. Reeds dies without having any regret for her past deeds. Jane returns to Thornfield Hall. Rochester, who had fallen in love with Jane, proposes to her for marriage. Jane readily accepts his proposal. At the time of marriage, a person named Mr. Briggs arrives at the church and discloses that Rochester is already married to his sister Bertha. Rochester then tells Jane and others how his family had married him off to Bertha, a mad woman. It is Bertha who is the mysterious woman living on the top floor. Jane's trust in Rochester shatters, and in spite of his earnest appeals, she leaves. After roaming for a day and feeling very hungry, she falls at the door of a farmhouse of a clergyman named St. John Rivers. He lived there along with his sisters Diana and Mary. They allow Jane to live with them. Jane starts working as a teacher at a girls' school. She also gets a lodge to live in. She comes to know that a beautiful lady named Rosamond is in love with John Rivers. But John Rivers does not want to marry her because he wants to go to India as a missionary and considers Rosamond unsuitable for the journey. John proposes to Jane for marriage, but is rejected every time. While she is there, the news comes to her that her uncle John Eyre has died and has left £20,000 for her. John Rivers turns out to be her cousin. She divides the inherited amount of money equally among the four, and thus each of them gets £5,000. John Rivers does not stop proposing to Jane. Finally, Jane prepares to accept him. One night she hears as if Rochester has called out to her, "Jane, Jane, Jane." The very next day, Jane leaves for Thornfield Hall. Upon reaching there, she finds it in ruins. She comes to know that Bertha, the wife of Rochester, had set the house on fire and killed herself. While trying to save her, Rochester became blind and crippled. Jane Eyre goes to Manor House in the forest where Rochester lives. Both get married. Rochester recovers partially and gets the sight in one of his eyes. Both Jane and Rochester live happily after that and have children. So here comes the end of the summary of the novel Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. So, my dear friends, if you have subscribed to my channel, it's nice. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, do subscribe to my channel so that in the time to come, I come up with final videos for you. And that's my promise. Thank you.